Welcome to Unredacted, Reveal's new podcast on all things e-discovery. I am George Socha with Reveal. Our guest today is Sylvia Bermudez. Sylvia is the clerk of the board for Coachella Valley Water District. Sylvia, I'd like to start with you telling us a little bit about your background and where you are and what you do today at Coachella Valley.
Sure. Thanks, George. I appreciate your time and appreciate being here. As you mentioned, I work with Coachella Valley Water District. I am the clerk of the board. I've been here, it'll be 9 years in March, so time has really flown by here. Prior to being here, I've worked primarily in local government. So I've worked for a couple of cities throughout Southern California. I worked for a county. So I've been in local government probably close to about 26 years now. So throughout my different roles and positions, I've always been involved in records and records requests, things of that nature. So kind of that's a little bit background. And, that has obviously carried on here to Coachella Valley Water District.
And that takes us to what I'd really like to talk about today, which is the challenges of managing public records requests in government and how you deal with those challenges, especially with the increasing number of records you face, the complexity of the requests, and no doubt the growing volume and complexity of the data you need to work with as well. So giving you that broad opening, take that where you want.
Well, as I said, I've been working in government some 26 plus years, and it's just been very interesting to kind of see the change and the progression, the increase in public records requests, starting way back, like I said, in the early 2000s, late 90s, when they were very uncommon. It was very rare that you got a public records request. People, I think the public didn't really know how to utilize that. It wasn't something that was very common to now today, where we're getting hundreds and hundreds of requests. We can get, several dozen sometimes in a day. It very much fluctuates, but it's just kind of been interesting to be able to see how public records requests have changed and progressed over the years, how members of the public utilize that kind of on a daily basis. To be able to get information and just the types of requests that come in now. It's been interesting to see kind of that change.
Walk me through the process a little bit. A public records request sounds to me like a request from a member of the public for some form of record. I'm sure it's both that simple and a lot more complicated. Please enlighten me.
Sure. Absolutely. So I'll kind of start with examples here at Coachella Valley Water District. So we get everyday requests that come in from, let's say, a property owner or a developer that is looking to either acquire a property or has acquired property, and they're looking to develop it in some way. So they want to know what utility services are available, or what is on the property, how close are they to our infrastructure. So they'll request plat maps, they'll request GIS boundary maps, and things of that nature. Those are the simple ones that we can handle. We probably get a handful of those every day. And those are easily kind of sorted through. We get them, we send the request out to our folks in our engineering department. They produce the maps, they produce the information, the records needed, and then we can send that off. And there's times that we can get those completed in a matter of an hour, right? We love those. We love those all day, every day. Then you get the ones now we're a little bit more complicated. What we've seen is, let's say there is some type of litigation, or whether it's something that's involved with us or maybe more of a civil matter. And firms will actually use the public records process to be able to access records, so they're not having to necessarily do it in the discovery portion of it.
So I used to, for example, when I was practicing, I didn't do that, but I used Freedom of Information Act requests to get information about companies, their marketing practices, or whatever it might be. I gather it's a similar thing, at least, right?
Yes, it is. So in California, we have the California Public Records Act request, which essentially is for all local agencies. So that includes your county government, your cities, special districts, water district, college district, schools, etc. So it's very much the same process. It outlines the types of records that are considered public, the process in which we must process those requests that come in, and so forth. So yes, it's very much the same.
Then these were the simpler ones, starting to edge into the more complicated. So let's pick up there from when I cut into the more complicated and what that looks like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The more complicated ones come in, again, they're either tied to some type of litigation, or um, it could be maybe a political controversial matter that may be out there, and we get a request that says, I would like any and all documents, communications, records related to this particular, let's say it's a contract that was awarded for a particular service. And maybe this is one of the other vendors that put in for this as well and was not awarded that contract. So we'll get, requests for that. And sometimes it could be as simple as there are no other records or very minimal records. And then there's those fabulous ones that we love that produce about 20,000 emails and, 15,000 records when you start to look at contracts and emails, depending on how far back those requests are going. So those tend to be a little bit more of the challenging ones just because of the amount of records that are involved, the amount of data, and the length of time that we have to go back and review, and then going through reviewing, sorting, redacting if necessary, if there's any sensitive information, any personal information, any type of customer data that we have to redact. So those tend to be a little bit more of the challenging ones. I would say where it's just a large volume of data where you have to be very thorough, very detailed in your review of documentation, because the last thing, I think one of the biggest fears that any of us have is releasing a document that contains confidential or sensitive data and we failed to redact that information.
So unlike that fairly simple 1 hour begun and done type of request, it sounds like with these more complicated ones, there are a whole series of steps you have to go through, starting with finding the right data in the first place.
Correct.
How do you deal with that?
Well, it definitely involves working and collaborating with various departments. Obviously, our IT department is heavily involved when it comes to the electronic records, our emails, anything in our Outlook, our calendars, things of that nature. And then I'm fortunate enough to have here a group of about 7 to 8 team members that are dedicated solely to our record system. So we have our own in-house warehouse, in addition to obviously our electronic records. My agency has about 22 million records, online digital records. And then we also have a physical warehouse that has probably about 4,500 of what we call the old banker boxes of original hard copy records. So those are kind of my two key divisions in a sense that I work with closely on records requests. And then, of course, working with each department based on the type of requests and the type of records that we're looking for. Anything that has to do with our projects, big engineering projects, obviously we work very closely with our Department of Engineering. Anything that has to do with our fiscal, any type of fiscal type of requests. Obviously, we deal with finance. Every now and then we get those personnel related issues. So we work with our human resources department and so forth. But I would say that our IT and my records team are the two divisions and the staff members that I work with on a regular basis.
You have to live in two different worlds simultaneously, the old world of paper and the newer world of electronic. The old world of paper, it's interesting. It used to be what we all did. There seem to be so few organizations left that have resources available to scan paper, work with paper as paper, and so on. how do you handle the paper side of things?
Again, I'm fortunate to have staff that is solely dedicated to that portion of it. So again, the staff that's in our records division. And while I would say most of our hard copy records are scanned, we keep a lot of those just because of the historical value of those records. These are our records that go back to 1918 when our agency was first established and so forth. So there's a lot of that historical value that being the reason why we keep them. But we also have a lot of old maps that we haven't had the opportunity to scan just because we're not able to do those in-house. So it is something that we're looking at to hopefully digitize and get scanned in with the hopes of being able to get rid of, some of those 4,500 boxes that we have sitting in our warehouse. But it definitely does take a great team to be able to do that and be able to kind of maneuver through the electronic records, the digital files that we have, while still managing and maintaining the hard copy files and ensuring that they're retained in a manner that preserves them.
Let's move then to the electronic side. You receive a request, you identify the types of things you're trying to look for. You go out and look for that, gather it up, and then what?
So I'll tell you what I used to do before, and then before I talk about what I do now. So
let's get the old and the new.
So old process is we'd either get an email or I'd get a letter, I'd get, a phone call, whatever that may be, and get the request. And then I'd send out multiple emails to multiple departments and multiple staff asking for records. And then I would get multiple emails back and I would have to track those. I track those in an old Excel spreadsheet, which I'm sure many others do as well. And some may still do.
I'm just imagining.
So I am tracking and logging everybody I sent an email to, everybody who received, that I received an email back from the records. I'm trying to create a folder where I drop everything in, all the records that are sent to me, I drop them in there. And then I start the manual, or used to start the manual review, opening up one document at a time, a PDF, going through that. And yes, I know.
It sounds like the work of months.
It could take days and days and weeks sometimes to really get through that. So that was kind of the PDF. And then the emails would get sent to me in a PST file. So then I would have to go through and read more emails than I ever wanted to read, and sort through, identify the emails that were responsive, kind of save those as a PDF, drop them into a folder, and go through. Once I'm done, then I'd go back, open up those PDFs, and then start the redaction process. Yeah, so it was a lot of long nights, sometimes weekends, days off, anytime that I had, I would be spent on going through this review process.
And it sounds like with all those different steps, a lot of opportunity for something to go wrong along the way.
Again, absolutely. Sometimes I think the amount of times that we would have to, or that I would personally feel I have to go back and double check and triple check. Did I redact this? I know this information is on here. Am I redacting, the customer data on this? Did I redact it on the 50 other pages? So there was a lot of stress and anxiety and sometimes probably duplicate work that was done just because I had to ensure that we are redacting the confidential sensitive information that is contained within these records. So very much time consuming, very much stressful, I have to say. So kind of fast forward a little bit to now, how we do the process. So essentially, part of it is still a little bit the same, where we send out an email and we advise folks, or I advise my team of the types of records we're looking for. And then once we get the records, we ingest them into Logical. So I can add up to 15, 20,000 records. I can add huge PST files, sometimes multiple PST files based on the keywords or the terms that we're looking for. And our email records retention is 2 years. So it doesn't sound like a lot, But sometimes, because we tend to be very cautious and we go very broad on our emails to ensure that we didn't miss something, I will come back and I have multiple PST files, each sometimes containing 10,000, 5,000, 7,000. So now I have all these emails and all these records that are put into Reveal. The beauty of it is once it's uploaded, I have the ability to go through and kind of sort through and eliminate, or not eliminate, but remove an unresponsive or non-responsive records. So I love the feature in the emails where you can go in, and sometimes the requests are very specific. I only want an email between Sylvia and George, or between Sylvia and so and so. And so it allows me the ability to say, okay, I know I have 7,000 emails, but I don't need all those emails. I only need the emails between Sylvia and George. And so all of a sudden, from 7,000 emails, I am down to 250 emails. And then
much more manageable.
Much more manageable. And then from there, I can say, okay, I only want the emails from Sylvia and George between this time period, or that they must contain this keyword or term, or they must have an attachment. So the ability to kind of sort through and filter at such different levels has been absolutely phenomenal, and such a time saver, both for myself and my staff.
You mentioned earlier, and you're probably planning on coming to this, that as you go through all of this, you have to be especially attuned to any personal identifiable information to make sure that you're not putting out into the world things that you shouldn't be. How do you handle that? How about old school and then new school? How did you and how do you?
So old school, I mean, if we go way, way back, we used to have a black marker and you blacked information out, put in a copy. And then a little bit more recent, I said, you could do it in Adobe. We would redact in Adobe and then save that revised PDF and so forth and do that. But again, very much time consuming, because you'd go through it, identify, for sure, it's a social security or a date of birth or a customer account information. And you go through but you always have to think, well, did I catch everyone? So I'd find myself going back page by page by page and making sure that I didn't miss anything.
Back in the old paper coding days, where I would go out to a warehouse and bring back a bunch of documents, and they'd go to a review team, and I'd have them sit down and what we then called code the documents. We would give them ideally a document that was no more than one standard size piece of paper with instructions for what to work for, because we found that if the instructions bled over into a second page, the things to look for, they just couldn't keep it all in their heads and do a good enough job. That quality dropped off. With that older method, I would think you'd have a similar problem in that you'd be looking for enough different types of PII. It would be really easy to glaze over and slip past and miss things.
Yeah.
Am I right in that evaluation?
Absolutely. Usually how I would do it is I would do it, I guess, in cycles or rounds. So the first round, I would say, okay, I'm looking for, let's say, an account number in this case. So I need to first go through every single document and find the account number. Because what I found is if I knew it was an account number, a name, a social security or address, and I'm trying to find all four in one document, I'm going to miss one somewhere. And again, it goes back to the anxiety, the stress of missing some sensitive or PII information. So I would start with the easiest, let's say the account information. I would go through, and let's say there's 50 pages. I would go through the 50 pages and only look for account numbers. So that's round one. Then I'd come back and do round two. Round two, let's say, is a home address or a social security. So now at round two, I'm only looking for this information. So again, at that time,
50 pages has now become 100 pages, and round three,
200
pages, 50 pages, and so on and so forth. Yep. And now, how do you approach it?
now reveal. You have the ability, obviously built in the system. It has some very commonly referenced PII information, but it also allows you to look at other types of information, right, that you can see. So you can identify, say, hey, in this case, this for whatever reason, maybe I'm looking for something other than the name, a date of birth, social security. In our case, the customer account number sometimes doesn't easily get identified. So we can add that in and say, look for this type of thing. And so now it not only as I'm reviewing the document, it'll indicate, hey, there's this little squiggle that comes out and says, hey, this is, considered PII. I can then say, in a sense, yes or no. And then the system will then continue to identify that. And at a click of a button, in a sense, or a mouse, I can redact all, let's say, the name or the home address or a social security, whatever that may be, that I've identified to be PII, and then it redacts it.
So that process of going through all 50 pages to find
Multiple
thing one,
Mhm.
instead of going click, 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 click through 50 pages, mark and click and all of that, it's indicate the thing you want, click, it takes care of the rest.
Done through all 50 pages.
No wonder you look relaxed now.
Yeah, you should have seen me a couple of years ago.
So you find the data you think you're looking for. You narrow it down so it fits the parameters you care about.
Mhm.
You identify the PII you want removed
Mhm.
and take care of that. What comes next?
Well, I mean, and it kind of depends. One of the other features I love in there is that you can tag documents. So you can tag specific documents for certain things. Sometimes as you're going through, you identify information that's exempt or confidential, attorney-client privileged. And so I love, that's another feature that I love. You can go in there and identify and say, yes, this is a document that's responsive. However, it's attorney-client privileged or it's exempt because of A, B, and C and so forth. So it gives you the ability to tag the documents differently, which is a process in there. Sometimes I do it before, sometimes after, just kind of depends on the amount of data and sometimes the steps that I take, to be honest. But that's another important step in the process is tagging the documents to ensure that these are responsive, these are not, and so forth. And then, of course, the redaction. And then at the end, then you just can compile the records. You can say, okay, I'd like to, compile a packet of just the responsive records, none of the confidential, none of the attorney-client privilege. They're redacted. You go through the process. It compiles this packet, and then there it is. You have it. And then usually for me, I export that information. I export it out, and then hit submit, and it's gone
So
to the
when you
requester.
export it out, what is it exported as? Does it all go into one Adobe PDF file?
You can. So you have the ability to export it into one single file, or you can export it into multiple files. I usually like to do my personal preferences one so that I don't have different to manage. So I will only take the responsive redacted records that I know, okay, this is what I'm going to produce as part of this public records request. I will export that as a PDF. And save it. I also save it just because our process is to save it and keep a copy for 2 years where required. I will save that, export it out, save it as my final packet in the sense it's being released to the requester. And then that is, then it's released to the requester. It's submitted out and it's done. I also will keep a copy of what I found that was considered responsive but confidential or attorney-client privilege, just so that if there's a question come back, if there's something that's attorney-client privilege or exempt, I have to notate that in my response saying that some records were withheld and cite the government code for the reasoning on why they were withheld.
Are you able to associate that code with that record as you're going through in the first place? Or how do you approach that?
Yeah, usually what I'll do is I identify the type of record, right? So I'll identify the record and then identify why it is exempt. You have the ability to indicate why this particular record or why this batch of records or emails is exempt. Yes, you
And you're
do.
doing that as you're going through the records.
Yes.
So
Yep.
then you've got that data to work with later on.
Exactly.
How is this approach received by the people who request the records? I mean, they don't necessarily know all the details you're going through, but they've asked you for records. Some period of time goes by, and then they get one large combined PDF.
Yes.
Is everything just hunky-dory? Do people have questions, concerns, challenges?
I would say majority of the people, one is most are absolutely pleasantly surprised by how quickly we can turn around requests. Because we do the standard when we receive it, and I know there's a large amount of data or records that we have to review and sort through and so forth. We notify them and say, hey, this is a very large request. It may take us some time. Based on our government codes, we can give them the extension. So in California, we have 10 days to respond from the receipt of the request as to whether we have the records. If we have the records and they're readily available, we produce them within that time frame. If the request is a large request that has a large volume of data, then we do have the ability to request an extension of 14 days to allow us an opportunity to review, filter through, redact if necessary, et cetera, et cetera. On those requests where we need time beyond that, what we do is we essentially release them on a rolling basis. We will go through, review, redact, release, review, redact, release, and so forth. But what I have found on those large ones that we go through, and we have the ability sometimes within those 10 or even that extension of 14 days, go through thousands and thousands of records and emails and sort through, filter through, redact, compile the responsive records and issue those out. And most often they're like, oh, wow, I thought it was going to take you longer. So they're usually very surprised and with our response time. And I would say I have not, at least that comes to mind, I haven't had a requester that has challenged or has had any concerns with our response, the records that are produced, or the process in which that we produce them, just because we are providing everything in once. And usually we're very clear. We'll provide in emails kind of some clarification that says, here are the records that are responsive. You'll note this includes emails, it includes hard copy, any files, et cetera, et cetera. And then in that, we also identify that certain records were identified that were exempt from disclosure. This is why they were exempt. We cite the government code and then just a brief explanation of what the records are. So I think that helps a little bit as well. But yeah, to date, nothing comes to mind where we've had a requester actually challenge the process or challenge how we're producing those or have any concerns as far as the types of records that have been released.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. This has been, for me, quite enlightening, helping me much better understand a world I don't always have much and haven't had much insight into. But thank you for joining us today. Sylvia, again, is the clerk of the board for Coachella Valley Water District. I am George Socha of Reveal, and this has been Unredacted. Sylvia, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it.